You have a bedroom, you have a door, you have walls. Your ancient ancestors had none of those things. No private rooms, no separate spaces, no door to close, no curtain to draw, no physical boundary between yourself and the rest of the group. In a band of 25 people moving through the landscape and sleeping together in the same cave or the same clearing, there was effectively no such thing as being alone, ever. So here is the question that scientists have genuinely debated. Did ancient humans just have sex in front of everyone? Did they have any concept of privacy at all? And if not, when did we get one and why? The answers pull in completely different directions depending on which evidence you look at. And the real story, the one that sits underneath all of it, is not just about sex. It is about one of the most fundamental shifts in human social life that has ever happened. A shift that changed everything about how we live, who we trust, and what we consider shameful. And it happened for a reason that will completely surprise you. To understand whether ancient humans had privacy, you first have to understand what privacy actually requires. Because privacy is not a feeling, it is an infrastructure. It requires walls. It requires a space that belongs to you or to you and one other person that other people do not enter without permission. It requires the concept of permission. It requires a social understanding that what happens behind a closed door is not the group's business. Ancient humans had none of this for the overwhelming majority of our species' existence. For the first 200,000 years of Homo sapiens, we lived in small nomadic bands. We slept where the landscape offered shelter in cave mouths, under rock overhangs, in temporary structures of branches and hides. There were no rooms, there were no individual sleeping spaces. Everybody was within earshot and usually within sight of everybody else every night. Modern hunter-gatherer groups, the closest living analog to this way of life, give us the clearest picture of what this looked like in practice. The Aka people of Central Africa, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer groups in the world, live in camps where the sleeping and living areas are shared and visible. Researchers who have studied their domestic life in detail documented something striking. Sexual activity in the AKA is typically covert, not because there are walls, but because couples deliberately move away from the sleeping area when they want to be intimate into the forest, away from the camp, out of sight. Let that land for a second. They didn't have privacy, so they created it, actively, deliberately, every time. Not because someone told them to, not because there was a rule written anywhere, but because the impulse to separate sexual activity from the group's gaze appears to be built into human behavior at a level deep enough that even people with no walls, no rooms, and no concept of private property still act on it. This is the first clue that the answer to our question is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Here is a biological fact about humans that almost nobody finds surprising, but should. Human females are one of the only mammals on Earth that do not visibly advertise when they are fertile. In almost every other species, the female's fertility is obvious. Baboons develop dramatic red swellings. Chimpanzees display visible genital swellings that signal precisely when mating will be reproductively successful. The male doesn't need to guess the female's body broadcasts the information clearly. Human females have what biologists call concealed ovulation. There is no visible signal, no swelling, no obvious behavioral change, no advertisement of any kind that a woman is in her fertile window. From the outside, a human female looks exactly the same at peak fertility as she does at any other time of the month. Why? This has been one of the most debated questions in evolutionary biology for decades, and the leading answers are revealing. One theory is what researchers call the mate confusion hypothesis. If no male can be certain when a female is fertile, then every sexual encounter carries the possibility of reproduction. This creates an incentive for males to stay close to a female partner consistently, rather than paying attention only during a visible fertility window and ignoring her the rest of the time. In other words, concealed ovulation may have evolved to keep pair bonds together. A male who sticks around all month, every month, because he can't be sure when fertilization is possible, is a male who is present when the child is born and when it needs to be fed and protected. A competing theory developed by anthropologist Sarah Hrdy suggests the opposite motivation. If a female mates with multiple males, none of whom womb can tell when she's fertile, then no single male can be certain which offspring are his. Every male in the group who has mated with her has some probability of being the father, and males across primates are significantly less likely to harm offspring that might be their own. Concealed ovulation, in this view, was a protection strategy distributing paternity uncertainty across multiple males to reduce the risk of any individual male harming the child. These two theories point in completely different directions about what ancient human sexuality looked like. One suggests pair bonding and relative exclusivity. The other suggests something considerably more fluid. Both have serious scientific support, and both get at the same underlying truth that the human female body evolved specifically to make the relationship between sex and reproduction less obvious, less public than in almost any other species. Something in our evolutionary history was already moving toward concealment long before we invented doors. Here is where the science gets genuinely contested, and where you need to know there are two serious competing views because both of them have evidence behind them. The first view comes from the standard narrative of evolutionary psychology. This model argues that ancient humans were broadly pair-bonded, that individual men and women formed relatively stable partnerships, that jealousy evolved as a mechanism to protect those partnerships, and that sex was mostly private because pair bonding creates an incentive for exclusivity and discretion. On this view, ancient humans did not have sex in front of everyone, because doing so would have threatened partnerships and invited conflict. The evidence for this includes the anatomy of human males. Compared to chimpanzees who live in openly promiscuous groups where multiple males mate with the same female within short time windows, human testicles are relatively small in proportion to body size. Testicle size across primates scales almost perfectly with the degree of sperm competition in a species mating system. Species where multiple males routinely mate with the same female at the same time produce enormous quantities of sperm because each individual sperm is competing against the sperm of other males. Humans don't, which suggests that whatever our ancestors were doing, it was not regularly putting multiple males' sperm in direct competition inside the same female at the same time. The second view, most famously argued in the 2010 book Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan and Casilda Jeffer, challenges this picture substantially. Ryan and Jetta argue that for most of human prehistory, before agriculture, before private property, before the concept of inheritance, humans lived in small cooperative bands where resources, including sexual partners, were shared more fluidly. They point to the behavior of bonobos, our other closest primate relatives, as genetically close to us as chimpanzees, where sexual activity is frequent, varied, and deeply social, used to reduce conflict, build alliances, and maintain group cohesion. They argue that the obsessive focus on monogamy and sexual privacy is not ancient, it is agricultural, that it emerged specifically when humans began farming, when land became property, when property could be inherited, and when suddenly it mattered enormously which children were biologically yours. Before farming, Ryan and Jeffer argue, nobody owned anything that could be passed on. Children were raised by the group. Paternity was not a legal or economic question, and sex was correspondingly less fraught, less hidden, and less tightly controlled. This view has been significantly criticized by other researchers, including evolutionary psychologists, who point out that jealousy, mate guarding, and sexual conflict appear across virtually every human culture, including hunter-gatherers, in ways that don't fit a simple picture of relaxed group sexuality. The truth, as is usually the case when smart people disagree loudly, is probably somewhere between the poles. Set aside the theoretical debate for a moment. Whatever ancient humans were doing sexually, the practical reality of their living situation tells us something important. They almost certainly did not have sex in the middle of the group's sleeping area, in full view of everyone, not because they had a concept of shame identical to the modern one, but because the evidence from modern hunter-gatherers living in functionally identical conditions consistently shows the same pattern. People find ways to be apart. They go to the edges of the camp, they go into the forest, they use darkness, they use the time when other people are asleep. The anthropologist Helen Fisher, who has studied human mating across dozens of cultures, describes this as one of the most consistent cross-cultural behaviors she has found. Across every human society ever studied, sexual activity is separated from the main social space. Even when there are no walls, even when there is no concept of private property, even when children sleep in the same space as adults. Adults find ways to move the sexual encounter out of the shared space. This is what makes humans unusual among primates. Chimpanzees and bonobos mate in the open, in front of the group, without any apparent concern for observation. Humans across all known cultures don't. Even when the infrastructure of privacy doesn't exist, the behavior of creating it does. The question is why? And the most compelling answer is not shame. Exactly, it is pair bonding. If you're in a relatively stable partnership with someone, having sex in front of the rest of the group advertises that partnership in a way that invites exactly the kind of conflict that threatens it. Other males see it as an opportunity. Other females feel rivalry. Group dynamics shift in ways that make survival harder for everyone. Going into the forest or waiting until dark or moving to the edge of the camp keeps the partnership quieter, the group calmer, and the pair bond intact. Privacy, in other words, may not have started as shame, it may have started as strategy. Here is the evidence that cuts through the debate in an unexpected direction. 30,000 years ago, before the invention of writing, before agriculture, before any settled civilization, someone carved a small statue of a woman, enormously wide hips, large breasts, exaggerated female form, and then someone else carved another one, and another. These figures, now called Venus figurines, have been found across Europe and Asia, spanning thousands of years and thousands of miles of territory. The oldest is the Venus of Hohlefels, carved from mammoth ivory in what is now Germany, dated to roughly 35,000 years ago. It is not a realistic portrait. Every feature associated with female reproduction, breasts, hips, abdomen, is dramatically amplified. Every feature not associated with reproduction, the face, the arms, the feet, is either minimized or absent. What does this tell us about ancient sexuality? At minimum, it tells us that ancient humans were thinking about sex symbolically, that sexuality had moved from a purely instinctual behavior into something that could be represented, contemplated, and given cultural meaning. You do not carve a 35,000-year-old figurine of exaggerated female form out of mammoth ivory, spending hours of careful, skilled work if sex is simply a physical act with no more significance than eating. Some researchers interpret the Venus figurines as fertility symbols, objects used in rituals to invoke successful reproduction, good hunting, the continuation of the group. Others see them as evidence of a culture that venerated the female reproductive body specifically. A few scholars have even argued they were the world's first art created for pleasure objects of desire, made by people who experienced desire and found it worth making permanent. What they tell us most clearly is that by 35,000 years ago, ancient humans had developed a rich interior life around sexuality. It was not just behavior, it was meaning, and meaning, the layering of emotion, symbolism, and cultural significance onto a physical act, is what creates the conditions for privacy. When sex is just physical, observation is irrelevant. When sex carries emotional weight, relational significance, and social consequences, when it is entangled with partnership, jealousy, loyalty, and identity, the desire to do it away from the group's eyes becomes almost inevitable. Whatever the degree of sexual privacy in ancient hunter-gatherer bands, something happened roughly 10,000 years ago that changed everything. Agriculture. The shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled farming is the single most consequential change in human social history. And one of its least discussed consequences is what it did to sex. Farming meant staying in one place. Staying in one place meant accumulating things, food stores, tools, livestock, land. Accumulating things meant having something to pass on when you died, and having something to pass on created, for the first time in human history, a urgent biological and economic question that had never existed before. Whose children are these? For a nomadic hunter-gatherer, this question carried limited consequences. The group raised children collectively. What any individual man owned, he carried on his back. When he died, there was nothing to inherit. But for a farmer with 10 acres of land, a herd of cattle, and a storehouse of grain, the question of biological paternity suddenly had enormous stakes. If you pass your land to your son, you want to be certain the boy is actually yours. If there is any uncertainty about that, the entire logic of inheritance, and with it, the economic stability of your family line, collapses. This created, almost overnight, demonstrate in evolutionary terms an intense social interest in controlling female sexuality. If a woman could not demonstrate fidelity, if her sexual behavior was visible, variable, or unclear, then paternity could not be established and inheritance could not be secured. Suddenly, the thing that had perhaps been relatively fluid in hunter-gatherer bands became the object of intense social regulation. Virginity became a concept, adultery became a crime, female sexuality became something that men, families, and eventually states invested enormous energy in controlling. The walls went up literally in the form of rooms and houses, and with them went the social expectation that what happened inside those walls was private, bounded, and subject to very specific rules. The bedroom was not built for comfort, it was built for control. So, did ancient humans have sex in front of everyone? The honest answer is probably not, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Not because they had shame in the modern sense, not because there were rules written down anywhere, but because the evidence from modern hunter-gatherers living in functionally identical conditions shows that humans consistently, across every culture ever studied, create separation between sexual activity and the group's shared space. Even when no walls exist, they go to the forest, they use the dark, they wait for others to sleep. Something in the human mating system, whether it is pair bonding, jealousy, the desire to keep partnerships stable, or something older and harder to name, generates the impulse toward concealment, even in people who have never heard the word privacy. At the same time, whatever sexual privacy existed in ancient bands was nothing like what we have today. There were no bedrooms, no locks, no real separation between the intimate and the communal. The covertness was behavioral, not architectural, a matter of moving to the edge of the firelight, not closing a door. The door came later, with the farm, with the field, with the question of who owns what and whose children will inherit it. Everything you think of as sexually private, the bedroom, the closed door, the concept of fidelity as a social obligation, the idea that what two people do together is nobody else's business, is, in the long history of our species, extraordinarily new. Your ancient ancestors didn't have walls, but they still went into the dark. And that impulse to separate the most intimate part of life from the eyes of the group may be one of the oldest things about us.